She was prepared to die with honor. That was what she'd been taught since childhood. That surrender was worse than death. That capture was a stain no woman could wash away. And so when American soldiers surrounded her unit in the burned-out village outside Manila, she closed her eyes, gripped the handle of her blade, and waited for the end. But death never came. Instead, she was given water, then a blanket, then a strange phrase spoken softly by a young American medic. "You're safe now." She didn't know how to respond. None of them did. The other women were silent as they were processed. No shouting, no beatings, no humiliation. They were assigned beds, handed soap, given clothes, hot meals, a room with curtains. Some thought it was a trick. Others believed it was psychological warfare. But days passed, then weeks, and nothing changed. One evening, after receiving a clean dress and a folded letter from the Red Cross, one of the women whispered something that stunned the rest. "This place feels like paradise." They were trained to expect horror. From the moment they could walk, Japanese girls were taught that surrender was the end of dignity. For men, it meant dishonor. For women, it meant something far worse. There were no tales of rescue, no stories of mercy, only whispered warnings of shame that bled into the bones. Some of these women had volunteered as nurses. Others followed their husbands to occupied territories. A few were conscripted to support the imperial effort abroad. They left home carrying the weight of loyalty and the unspoken understanding that if captured, they must not live. American soldiers, in their eyes, were demons of propaganda, faces without mercy, hands without restraint. They had been shown leaflets of mutilation, of humiliation, of women crying blood. They were told that no woman returned from captivity with her soul intact. So when the bombs fell and the defenses crumbled, they clung to knives, to pills, to silence. Some hid. Others wept quietly in the rubble, eyes fixed on nothing. A few tried to disappear into death before capture could stain them. And when it came capture, it did not feel like defeat. It felt like erasure. Their names were no longer their own. Their voices shrank behind their teeth. They avoided eye contact, hunched their shoulders, braced for every sound. The first time an American soldier approached, one woman stopped breathing. She thought it would happen then, the proof of everything she had believed. But the man simply looked at her, hesitated, and then stepped back. She lived, and that was a betrayal of everything she'd expected. Inside the truck, as the camp grew closer, she held herself rigid. Her hands were fists in her lap, knuckles white, shoulders trembling. Around her, the others sat just as still, silent statues carved from fear and memory. They expected punishment. They expected shame. They expected to vanish. The gate opened with a slow groan of metal, and every woman held her breath. They had rehearsed this moment in their minds, always ending in horror. The stories they had been told, the ones whispered in training camps and schoolyards, did not prepare them for this. They expected cages, beatings, spit in the face. They expected humiliation. Some had spent the entire journey curled into themselves, refusing to speak, preparing mentally for the end of dignity. But what they saw confused them. Trimmed grass, a path swept clean, flower beds, a small building with windows open to let in the breeze. This wasn't the America they feared. This wasn't a prison. It looked like a boarding school. The guards didn't shove them. They pointed, not harshly, but firmly. One even nodded, as if to say, "This way, please." Inside the barracks, there were rows of narrow beds. Each had a pillow, 2 folded blankets, a white towel, a small wooden shelf with soap, a comb, and, most strangely, a mirror. The room was silent except for their cautious footsteps. One woman reached toward the bed. Her fingers hovered, trembling. She didn't touch it. Another took a step forward, stopped, glanced at the guard, and then finally sat down. Nothing happened. No yelling, no orders, no punishment. They weren't sure what to do. An American nurse entered the room. She was young, her expression unreadable. She held a clipboard and began to call their names. She mispronounced them, softly, carefully. One by one, the women nodded, confused. No one had spoken their names since capture. They had become numbers, faces, burdens. Later, they were brought food, not scraps, not tasteless rations. A bowl of white rice, a slice of bread, a small dish of pickled vegetables, and soup, rich, hot, full of real flavor. The smell alone weakened some of them, but no one moved. They waited for the trick, the insult, the moment when it would be snatched away. No such moment came. Eventually, one woman took a bite. Her eyes did not widen. She did not smile. She simply ate. The woman beside her followed, then another. The room remained quiet, but something shifted. Not trust, not yet, but something. When they finished, the bowls were collected. One guard nodded. Another said, in broken Japanese, "You may rest." They didn't believe it. That night, no one slept. They lay on clean sheets, staring at the ceiling. Some kept their shoes on. Others wrapped their arms around themselves as if expecting to be dragged away. But nothing came. No threats, no interrogations, just silence and the strange smell of laundry soap. The next day brought another surprise. Showers, separate stalls, real water, hot, not warm. Towels that smelled faintly of lavender. No watching eyes, no mocking. They washed in silence. Some wept. Some stayed under the stream too long. One collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed by the feeling of being clean. Later, they were given notebooks. No instructions, no restrictions. A translator explained they could write letters, or journals, or nothing at all. Most stared at the blank pages as if they were traps. One wrote her name. Another wrote nothing but a single line, "I am alive." Another woman spent an hour drawing the outline of her childhood home from memory, then ripped it out and hid it inside her pillowcase. That night, the lights went out early. As the room sank into darkness, someone whispered, "Do they think we're human?" No one answered, because none of them knew what to believe anymore. In the following days, routines settled in. Meals arrived at the same time. There were no shouted commands, only gestures and brief instructions. They were not forced to work. Some helped clean their barracks voluntarily. Others sat outside under the sun, sketching, writing, or simply staring at the sky. Still, they spoke little. Not because they weren't allowed to, but because none of them had the words for what was happening. Each kindness received became a new weight. Each day without cruelty made the silence heavier, and yet slowly, without ceremony, they began to exhale. They had survived the battlefield, but no one had prepared them for peace. Inside the camp, time did not move the same way. There were no air raid sirens, no screaming commanders, no cold dawn roll calls. There were birds, and clocks that chimed, and quiet footsteps on wooden floors. It felt like slipping into someone else's life, and they didn't know what to do with it. For the first time in months, maybe years, they were no longer afraid for their lives. And that, more than anything, unsettled them. Some of the women continued to sleep with their shoes on. Some hoarded bread under their pillows. Others refused to speak, afraid their voice might break the illusion. One kept a blade made from a sharpened spoon, hidden beneath her mattress. When asked why, she simply said, "In case it starts again." But it didn't start again. Instead, each day brought more signs that this new reality might be real. One woman was handed a needle and thread and invited to mend a torn curtain. Another helped carry books into a supply room. No one forced them. No one shouted. That frightened them more than punishment ever could. Because it meant the war was still inside them, but no longer outside. And if the war wasn't outside anymore, who were they fighting? At night, some would lie awake and whisper to each other in the dark. The conversations were slow, hesitant. One asked, "Why do they smile at us?" Another answered, "To mock us." But even she didn't sound convinced. One woman admitted she missed her home. Another said she dreamed of her sister. A third confessed she no longer remembered what month it was. Shame mixed with relief. Fear with guilt. How could they feel gratitude for a place they were supposed to hate? How could they begin to trust the people they had been trained to kill? A few began to write more in their notebooks. The entries were short, fragmented, but revealing. "I smiled today. I hope no one saw. I had seconds at dinner. I feel ashamed. They asked me if I wanted more tea. I said yes." The acts were simple, but their implications were profound. They weren't just being treated humanely. They were being treated like people who might still have futures. One morning, the guards delivered small radios to the barracks. The women were told they could listen during designated hours. Western music floated into the space, jazz, soft piano, sometimes voices in English too fast to understand. One woman sat near the radio and cried without sound. Another hummed, not because she liked the music, but because she didn't hate it. Later, the nurse came back with a stack of library books, English-Japanese dictionaries, simple novels, a few picture books. One woman opened a page and stared at a drawing of a family sitting under a tree. She traced the outline with her finger for a long time. The next day, she asked the nurse, haltingly, how to pronounce the word peace. In moments like these, the internal war flared again. Some women turned away. One accused another of betrayal. "You're forgetting who they are." The other woman didn't reply, because the truth was, she didn't know who they were anymore, or who she was either. For months, their survival had been defined by hatred, by defiance, by an unyielding belief in what they had been told. But now that belief was unraveling, thread by thread, replaced by something more fragile and terrifying. Doubt. They had entered the camp as enemies, but in the stillness, in the soap and notebooks and radios and smiles, they were becoming something else, something they didn't yet have a name for, something that scared them more than any battlefield ever had. One night, a woman rose from her bed and stepped outside. The sky was dark but clear, dotted with stars. She hadn't seen them in so long, not properly. In war, the sky had been a place of fear. Bombers came from the sky. Fire fell from the stars. But here, the stars just watched. She sat on the steps and breathed slowly. Across the yard, an American soldier patrolled quietly. He didn't acknowledge her. He didn't point his weapon. He simply kept walking, hands tucked behind his back. She wondered if he had a sister, if he had a wife, if someone in his family also feared monsters from across the ocean, and if she had been one of them. The thought made her shiver. Not from cold, from knowing that for the first time, she wasn't sure who the monster was, and maybe, just maybe, there wasn't one at all. It started with a cough, dry, shallow, but persistent. By the second night, her breathing had worsened. The others in the barracks heard her wheezing in the dark, struggling against each breath like it was a battle she could no longer fight. Sweat soaked her collar. Her skin had turned pale beneath the dim light. No one said anything. They had seen illness before. In the field, in the camps, back home during air raids. Illness, untreated, meant violence. It meant preparing the body for the earth. But this wasn't the field, and they weren't free to mourn. At dawn, the American nurse came by, as usual, to check on the beds. She paused when she saw the woman. Quietly, she knelt, pressed her palm to the woman's forehead, then her fingers to the pulse at her neck. "Too hot," she muttered. Within minutes, 2 American medics arrived with a stretcher. The other women froze. One whispered, "Where are they taking her?" No one answered. The sick woman didn't resist. She couldn't. She was carried across the yard into a small building none of them had entered before. A sign hung over the door. Infirmary. Inside, the nurse worked quickly. Cool cloths, sips of water. Something in a syringe that made the pain slow down. They bathed her skin, changed her linens, cleaned her fingernails. A doctor arrived and spoke calmly, examining her chest, listening to each labored breath. She faded in and out of sleep. But in one lucid moment, she opened her eyes and saw the nurse sitting beside her, reading softly from a small book. It wasn't in Japanese, but the tone was kind. No one had ever read to her before. 3 days passed. On the fourth, she sat up. The barracks grew still when she returned. She looked thinner, weaker, but her eyes were clear. One of the other women helped her to her bed. "She should have died," someone whispered. "She didn't," another replied, and no one could say why that mattered so much. That night, after lights out, someone left a folded paper crane on her pillow. No one admitted to making it. In silence, she held it in her hand, then placed it gently on the wooden shelf beside her bed. For the first time in weeks, she slept without coughing. The mail came once a week, delivered by a quiet Red Cross officer with a clipboard and a canvas bag. Most of the women ignored it. For months, they had lived without words from home. They had assumed there was no one left to write, or no one who dared to. Hope was dangerous. It made the silence louder. But one morning, the nurse walked in holding a small envelope. She looked directly at one woman and said her name softly. The woman didn't move at first. She blinked slowly, as if the name didn't belong to her anymore. The nurse stepped closer, holding out the letter with both hands. "It's from Japan," she said gently. The woman reached for it, fingers trembling. The envelope was thin, worn from travel, creased at the corners. The handwriting was familiar. She turned it over twice before carefully opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 3 short paragraphs. The first line made her breath catch. "My daughter, you are not forgotten." It was from her mother, written in careful brushstrokes. The letter spoke of the garden back home. The plum trees had blossomed late. Her brother had survived the last air raid. They had no idea if she was alive, but they prayed each night as if she were. The woman read the letter 5 times, then 10. She folded it and unfolded it again, smoothing the creases like fragile silk. Others gathered nearby silently. No one asked to read it, but their eyes followed every movement of her hands. Later that evening, she took out the letter and read it again under the dim light above her bed. Her lips moved, forming each word slowly. Then she placed it in her notebook and pressed the cover closed. That night, she slept with the letter against her chest. No one spoke about it the next day, but something in the room felt warmer. The next week, 3 more women received letters. One fainted when her name was called. Another broke down sobbing, clutching the envelope to her chest without even opening it. It was not just paper, it was proof. Proof that someone out there still remembered them. Not as prisoners, not as enemies, but as daughters. That afternoon, one woman sat quietly in the corner of the barracks, copying kanji onto a scrap of cardboard. She was teaching another how to write her brother's name again. Hope, once a stranger, had begun to sit beside them. It began with laundry. The American nurse had asked, almost casually, if anyone wanted to help fold the linens. There was no pressure, just a question. Most of the women pretended not to hear, but one stood up. She followed the nurse across the yard into a quiet room filled with steam and the smell of soap. Baskets of towels were stacked in corners. The nurse showed her how to fold them the American way. She watched, then nodded. By midday, the folded stacks looked identical. The next day, another woman went with her. By the end of the week, 5 were helping. No one called it work. No one forced them. But something about the rhythm, fold, stack, fold again, brought a strange calm. Their hands remembered how to create order. In a world that had collapsed, the symmetry of a neat pile felt like something worth building. Then came the invitation. One of the American guards had brought in a box of craft supplies, scissors, colored paper, glue. A few of the POWs had stood at a distance, unsure what to make of it. But the young interpreter said softly, "For you, if you want." They made cranes first, then flowers, then little houses. Soon, the window ledges of the barracks were lined with paper ornaments, bright against the worn wood. Some made decorations for the nurse's office. One woman folded a set of dolls and left them on the steps of the infirmary. Music played while they worked, soft, foreign tunes from the radio. At first, the melodies were strange, but soon, someone hummed along. Another tapped her finger to the rhythm. It wasn't joy, not quite, but it was a shadow of it. On Sundays, the guards set up a projector in the yard. Films were shown, silent comedies and nature reels. No one understood the language, but laughter still happened. Not every woman came, but some sat on blankets in the grass, arms around their knees, watching shadows flicker across the side of a whitewashed wall. They didn't clap at the end, but they didn't walk away either. Later, someone painted a small sign and placed it by the barracks door. Just one word, carefully written in English. Quiet. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a plea. It was a choice. They had stopped counting the days. What had once felt like a waiting room before punishment had slowly transformed into something else, something harder to define. It was no longer a prison. Not exactly. They were still watched, yes, still surrounded by fences, still guarded, but no one yelled at them. No one humiliated them. No one reminded them, daily, that they were defeated. The reminders came from within. The guilt, the confusion, the quiet ache of adapting to safety. These were harder to ignore than any barbed wire. One morning, a woman rose early and swept the barracks floor without being asked. Another adjusted the blanket on her neighbor's bed. A third reminded the nurse, softly, that they were running low on soap. These were small acts, but they weren't the acts of prisoners waiting to be freed. They were the habits of people who had begun to live. At first, no one spoke about the shift. It happened in gestures, glances, in the silence that no longer felt hostile. One woman requested a dictionary. Another began labeling items in both English and Japanese. Soon, the walls near their bunks were filled with words: mirror, blanket, cup, hope. That last one was written by a woman who denied writing it. During evening walks in the yard, a few began practicing English with the younger guards. Nothing formal, just greetings, small questions, laughter when words were mispronounced. The guards didn't mock them. They corrected gently. One day, a woman laughed. Not out of sarcasm, not out of hysteria, just laughed. No one punished her, and that may have been the moment something truly changed. They began sharing stories, not about the war, not yet, but about gardens, siblings, favorite foods. One woman described her grandmother's tea ceremony. Another taught a few how to fold paper into birds with flapping wings. The camp didn't shrink. The fences didn't disappear. But the world inside them began to grow. They were still POWs. That fact hadn't changed, but their definitions were shifting. A prisoner survives. A person chooses. And somewhere in between those two truths, they found space to breathe. That same week, a woman who had barely spoken since arrival asked the nurse for a pencil. Not a pen. A pencil, so she could erase her mistakes. She didn't say what she planned to write. 2 days later, she handed the nurse a folded sheet of paper. On it was a poem, written in careful, unsteady English. The grammar was broken, the spelling uncertain, but the last line was clear. "Thank you for not making me afraid." The nurse posted it on the wall, beside the radio. No one commented, but almost everyone read it. Evenings grew softer, less tense. Women lingered longer outside after meals, watching clouds pass. Some sat cross-legged in circles, teaching each other songs from childhood, their voices low and hesitant, like they were borrowing sound from a previous life. When a guard passed by, they stopped. Not from fear, out of reflex, but then, slowly, they would resume. They still wore the same clothes, slept on the same beds, ate from the same trays. But somehow, they no longer carried their shame like a second skin. Something invisible had peeled away. Something quiet had taken root. They arrived as enemies. They were taught to hate, to fear, to expect cruelty. But in quiet corners of the camp, they were handed towels, given notebooks, spoken to by name, shown how to fold paper into birds, given time to sleep, to think, to remember they had once been human before they were soldiers. No one asked them to forget the war, but someone reminded them what it meant to survive it. And that reminder came not through force, but through kindness, steady, patient, relentless. It didn't erase the pain. It didn't heal the shame, but it shifted something inside them. Something small and quiet and irreversible. So what do we make of this? If mercy could change even one prisoner, what else could it have done? If more people dared to offer it, and if those we once called enemies could be treated with dignity, what does that say about how we treat each other now? The following excerpts were found decades later, buried in archives, family trunks, and Red Cross reports. Rare fragments of truth that survived long after the women returned home. Most never spoke of their time in American camps. In Japan, silence was survival. But some wrote, quietly, privately. And what they wrote did not align with what their country expected of them. One letter, never sent, dated February 1945. Dearest Mother, I know you may never receive this. I am alive. That is the first miracle. The second is that I am treated not as a prisoner, but as a person. They call me by name. They give me food. They gave me a mirror. I looked at myself for the first time in months and saw a woman. Not a ghost. I wept. Not from pain, but from recognition. Another entry from a journal smuggled home in the lining of a coat. Today I folded a paper crane with a girl from Nagoya. The nurse gave us colored paper. We laughed when we couldn't remember the steps. A guard walked by and smiled. I wanted to hide the crane, as if it were contraband. But I placed it on my bed. I have not made something with my hands in so long. From a Red Cross report, filed anonymously by an American nurse, March 1945. They do not trust us, not fully. But they no longer flinch when we speak. One woman asked for the English word for sister. I told her. She whispered it to herself several times. Another sat beside me today as I sorted bandages. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. I think some part of her was trying to remember how to be unafraid. An unnamed Japanese POW wrote in a scrapbook journal, "The food is simple, but they give it gently. The beds are narrow, but they are offered with care. I do not know if this is forgiveness, but it is something warmer than survival." These were not grand declarations. They were quiet observations, private reckonings, moments captured in ink because the voice could not be trusted to carry them aloud. History often remembers the violence, the numbers, the terms of surrender, but these words, unofficial, uncensored, unsent, remind us that dignity can live even in captivity. And sometimes, the smallest mercies are the hardest to forget. Another letter, translated and archived in 1973, came from a former POW who never spoke publicly, but left behind a box of unsent notes. They gave us books. We could not read them at first, but I ran my fingers over the words. One page had a picture of a bird in flight. I stared at it for a long time. I think it reminded me of freedom, not the kind that comes from open gates, but the kind that grows quietly inside. I am still not sure what to do with that kind of freedom. These voices are rare, not because they didn't exist, but because no one asked for them. What they left behind is more than testimony. It is tension, compassion, contradiction. Proof that war does not end cleanly. proof that kindness doesn't erase history, but it leaves a mark on it. And sometimes, that mark is enough to change how we remember everything else. By the end of World War II, over 35,000 Japanese soldiers had been captured by Allied forces. Of those, more than 5,000 were detained in American-run prison camps, most located across the Pacific, in places like Hawaii, Guam, and the U.S. mainland. Among them were a small but significant number of female POWs, nurses, support staff, and civilians swept up in the collapse of the Empire's Pacific Front. The survival rate for Japanese POWs in American custody was astonishingly high, over 95%. Compare that to the Soviet Union, where Japanese POWs were deported by the tens of thousands to labor camps across Siberia. There, an estimated 60,000 Japanese soldiers died, mostly from cold, starvation, and exhaustion. The death rate ranged between 10% and 25%, depending on the camp and year. In China, the conditions were often chaotic. Some Japanese POWs were killed upon capture. Others were paraded through villages, subjected to public humiliation. There was no unified system, and survival often depended on luck or local leadership. And then there was Japan itself. Captured Allied soldiers in Japanese custody, Americans, Australians, Britons, endured some of the harshest treatment of the war: beatings, starvation, forced labor, executions. In some camps, the death rate climbed above 30%. Female Allied prisoners in Japanese custody were especially vulnerable, facing both physical hardship and the constant threat of sexual violence. These numbers do not erase what happened in American camps. Not all stories were kind. There were still moments of cruelty, still guards who abused power, still trauma that lasted for years. But when placed side by side, the data paints a complex truth. American policy toward POWs, shaped by the Geneva Convention, international oversight, and public scrutiny, resulted in camps that, while imperfect, prioritized survival. The contrast is most visible in personal outcomes. Many Japanese POWs who returned from American camps reintegrated into society. Some, decades later, even admitted to being grateful for their time in captivity, not for the war, but for what it taught them about humanity. Those who returned from Soviet camps spoke little. Many suffered from lifelong illness, mental breakdowns, or social rejection. The same silence hung over survivors of Chinese captivity, where records were sparse and recognition even rarer. Perhaps the cruelest irony was that returning from an American camp was not always seen as a blessing in Japan. POWs were often viewed as shameful reminders of surrender. Some were ostracized. Some never told their families the full truth. One woman, when interviewed in 1988, said simply, "The Americans fed us. But when I came home, no one asked if I was hungry." That sentence, small, quiet, devastating, captures the strange middle ground these women inhabited. They had been prisoners of the enemy, and yet, in some ways, they had been freer inside the fences than outside them. Even the structure of the camps reflected ideological difference. In Germany, camps run by the Nazis adhered strictly to military hierarchy, on paper. In practice, brutality was often left unchecked. Soviet POWs were executed en masse. Polish prisoners were worked to death. Red Cross access was limited, and documentation heavily censored. In contrast, American camps were monitored regularly by international observers. Reports show that prisoners were given access to mail, recreational activities, even cultural exchange. There were cases where Japanese prisoners taught origami or calligraphy to American personnel. Odd, quiet acts of mutual recognition in the middle of a global war. This is not to excuse or romanticize captivity. It is to acknowledge a contradiction, that a prison can offer more humanity than a home, and that mercy, applied with consistency, leaves traces that statistics cannot fully capture. These were not just camps, they were mirrors. And in the rare case of women POWs, what was reflected back at them was not always cruelty, but possibility.